going to start shortly. And so where are we on the roadmap? We're finally getting down into the second bullet point. We've been spending a lot of time on miscellaneous concepts. Today we'll start talking about SAML. And then next couple of sessions, we'll do a quick overview of OAuth and OpenID. And then we're going to go deep, deep, deep into single sign-on and especially deep into OAuth, because from what we've heard, that's what you really have to know. We're going to spend at least 3 sessions on OAuth and the various aspects of it and the various flows. Also, mark your calendars. Our final meeting is scheduled for December 21st. That's going to be a final review, and plan on spending 2 hours on that, just so we have lots of time to review all the different concepts that we're going to be going through. And so today's presenters, we're going to have Edith talking about the concept of login flows. Jeff, I don't see him on yet, but hopefully he'll be joining, and he'll do a show and tell of login flows. And then we're going to talk as a group about SAML and how do you think about it? How do you explain it to others? What are the important high-level concepts that we need to know? Again, not a deep dive on SAML today, but just so we have some different ways to explain SAML, because everybody thinks of it a little differently, and hopefully we can learn from the group and figure out a way that people can understand on what works best. So Edith, I believe you are on. Yes, you are. So I'm going to stop presenting, and if you can go ahead and start presenting.
Hello, everybody. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. I am going to talk a little bit about login flows in this session. This is about some concepts. The first thing is that a login flow is a Salesforce feature that directs user through a login process. And this happens before they can access the Salesforce org or community. So basically, it's a process that you can run after the user is authenticated on Salesforce and before they can proceed to the org itself. So you can use this feature to control the business processes that you need your users to follow when they log in into Salesforce. Something important is that these login flows do not replace the existing authentication process that happens on Salesforce. They just integrate extra steps or, for example, asking the user for information after they authenticated. There are 2 types of login flows that we can create. The first one is the screen flow. We can use the Cloud Flow Designer to do this. And the other one is coding using Visualforce pages. Basically, we can have as many login flows as we want, and we can assign each login flow to each profile. Each profile can have a different login flow if we want so. These login flows can be applied to Salesforce, the communities, or the mobile version of Salesforce. And the authentication they support is username and password, SAML, single sign-on, or social sign-on logins. So how it works, first we create our business process using either Workflow Designer or Visualforce page. Then we associate the user profile that we want with the flow that we just created or the code that we created. And what happens at runtime is that during the login, the user gets redirected to our flow or to our process. At that moment, the user just has a restricted access to the login flow, nothing else. And once the process has happened successfully, the user gets redirected to Salesforce. So some examples of why we need this is, for example, sometimes we want the user to review or update information, or to configure extra ways of authentication, for example, 2-factor authentication with third parties, products, or even more like a stronger authentication methods with some other third-party products like using hardware tokens or SMS or voice delivery services like these companies, for example. And these companies And generally, they provide the code that you just have to add to your org and then associate the code with the profile that you want the login flow to happen for. And yeah, basically that's it.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Jeff. I see you've joined, so go ahead and give some show and tell on login flows. What does it look like in real life?
Switching over to present, and all right. So first one, I did two different ones.
Jeff,
one
nothing's
of them.
Coming across.
Oh, okay. Let me try this again.
And if you're on a work computer, I had this problem before where it like refused to share my screen. Oh,
I just didn't go through the 3 clicks. I thought I could click once and get there. So my fault. Now, so I set up 2 of them here. I set up one which is collect the information. Then I will go to another org and show the doing the 2-factor where it sends you a code but does the code all the time. So on this first one, it's in a dev org. And as already indicated, that you have to do your normal login first, and then it takes over. So you first have to authenticate. Once you've authenticated, now I'm actually into the flow itself. So what I'm doing here is basically just throwing up some information that exists for the user, asking them to verify that that stuff is correct. They can make the changes here if they want. You can set specific things that are required. And so I'll just change something here. And then I added a little extra piece here just to show that things were getting done, that I basically go back to the database, pull the data out to verify that it has in fact been changed. And then you can finish. And at that point, you now get into the org. And you saw there was no way to get around that. But basically, you log in, the page comes up, you have to enter information. Had you not entered, in fact, actually, let's do that since it's fairly quick. If we do not put in one of the required items, it will not let us move forward. Basically similar to entering data, tells you have to have something there. And basically let you in. Do we want to look quickly at what those look like just to see how extensive they are? Okay, so good. We'll go to that wrong click. Let me log out and go in as a user that can see that. All right, so head over to flows. And as indicated, the login flow is basically just a regular flow, but you can hook it to the actual login. And I'll show you a couple of extra things you also get because it's a login flow. So we'll look at the welcome flow. Does anyone know how to make it stop asking every time?
No, drives me nuts.
Okay, I just thought it was me that couldn't figure this out.
Maybe somebody else does.
I just like that you're on your 9th version of that.
Well, I don't do a lot of flows. So most of it is not the fact that it's difficult, it's the fact that I had to figure out again how to use flows because it's not a normal part of what we do. So basically it's coming in, you do a lookup on the user just to get some specific information so you can then do a search. And this is the area I want to kind of point at. There's a very specific piece that's actually not here, sorry. This is just creating an object to put the information that you pull out of Salesforce in. I'm sorry, it's on the other one that I need to look at, the 2-factor that I want to get into. So then the screen basically just allows you to define whatever fields you want. As you can see, you can have both input fields and default them with values that come from the data that you're pulling in, or you can have just output, set it as a text field and put really anything you want, which can be a combination of text or a combination of fields also. So you don't really want them to change that. You just want to display what's there. Then basically based on what they enter in, you store that back into the database. You can define however many fields you want. So you can have as many fields as you want. You have to capture the fields first. Let me go back. I'm sorry. That's what I want to do on the first one here. You have to, from the user object, you have to define what fields you want to pull out of the actual data so that you can then display them. You can't just get access to them because you're in here. What I wanted to show is this login flow user ID. This is a variable that you set that picks up the ID that you're logging in as. And that's what I wanted to show over here on the piece that's really just for login flows. That when you come in, there's a series of variables that you can set to access pieces of information that have to do with you logging in. So there's the login type, the IP address, platform application, so forth. And this user ID is basically the ID that you logged in as once you did your authentication. And there's a very specific format you have to use in your variable for that in order to tie it to that incoming ID. That's just a link that happens in login flows that you really don't set up in some of your other flows. You probably have system variables and whatnot, but this is one that's very particular to the login flow coming in. And that was set up as a separate variable prior to coming into here so that you could then just use it within that search.
So Jeff, this is Terry. Quick question. Is there any other differences on how you set up the flow that defines it as being specific to login flows, or is it just those extra variables that are available?
Well, it's only these extra variables if you want to pull stuff from, let's say, use something that's part of what's coming in. Otherwise, no, it's just a basic flow. And we'll look inside the one I have for two-factor because I'm not actually pulling this data back, but I still think it comes down to the only thing that makes it different to login flow is you have to link to something as part of the login. Other than that, there's nothing more that I saw that was different. So basically, a screen to capture. You then take what was in that screen and store it. Then the extra part that I did is I went back and did another lookup using the same ID back to the data, and then just displayed that again to make sure that you had in fact saved it. You have to look it up again because you can't use the object that's storing the data because you really take it out of the screen, stick it into the database so that I pulled it back out just to verify that it had in fact changed.
Jeff, can you go over to the Explorer tab on the left? Because I want to point this out because I banged my head on a wall for a while until I figured this out. So you have to actually define that variable with that specific case-sensitive name. Those variables don't just come in
actually very case-sensitive. I didn't have it defined this way. It didn't work. I had a capital ID instead of a capital I lowercase d. It did not work until it was exactly that format.
Okay.
And this URL, which I'll include in the set of things we're doing, this explains it very clearly and gives us these specific things you can use to capture that information coming in.
Yeah, but the important point to know, because they showed this on a video that I watched and said, oh, you have all these variables available. Well, I go into my Explorer or I try to set them thinking they're global variables and they're not there. So you have to declare those variables first as an input variable of type text with that exact case-sensitive name.
Right, that's that very specific thing that ties to the login flow versus some of your system variables, which are going to be there if you go and look. Some of the things that have to do with your session, but for whatever reason, these are very specific things you have to define as a certain way.
Yeah, it's one of those hidden resources inside flows that if you know how to name it, you can get access to it.
Yep. Any other questions while we're here? Otherwise, I'll jump over and show you the two-factor one.
Jeff, so the login flows, I'm assuming they are applicable for the mobile experience as well?
Yes, to be honest, I did not try this with my phone. The the previous that they were, the person that was talking before indicated it was really for any type of login. I will try this on my mobile device. I'm gonna have to do several verifications and whatnot on that, but I'll try it and then report back on whether it works the same way.
Yeah, and one of the videos in this guide, they actually go through an example. One of those special variables you can set will actually tell you whether the user's on mobile or if they're on a web browser, and you can actually customize your flow to go one way or another depending on how they're logging in.
Right, interesting, yeah. And I do have, the next one, I do have a decision point to show you what happens there. So let me get out of this one. And that's in a different org. So this particular one, all it does is when you come in, it basically generates a code, sends it to you, and you cannot move on until you actually enter that code. Let me get over here to my other system and get my code. And this is an all the time two-factor. This is not like Salesforce, which just does it if that particular sends out the verification code if it's a new device or a new browser you're coming from. This will happen all the time. No matter where you log in from, you'll have to enter a code for the added security. And it's really that simple. Once you enter your code, you're in. So it doesn't really do much other than get the code, but let's take a look at what's actually going on there. And this is just one way of doing it. And this one's was thrown together fairly quickly. We're not putting a particular time on that code. We are, in fact, deleting the code once it's used, but we don't say you have to get to it within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever else. It's really just setting a code that the person can use to get in. And then it's deleted so it cannot be reused. This one didn't take, I actually took up to 4 versions still, but that was somebody who knew how to develop flows. So what this as this is coming up, this has an object, a custom object in the database, which really has an ID and a generated code. So at the time the person logs in, it into this database, puts their ID, which then generates the code, pulls that code out, sends it to them to their defined email, and then basically just sits and waits with a screen, that screen that we showed, saying, enter your code back in. Once the code comes in, if it's correct, we bring them in and delete that record out of the table. Otherwise, we throw up an error message saying your code is not valid. So we're creating, at the time coming in, we create that custom object that stores the person's user ID and then generates that particular code for them. Pull the code out as well. Sorry, we get their email address based upon their ID. Then we grab the security token and we basically send it to them. And then it pops up to the screen and it just waits for them to come in. So it's a pretty straightforward mechanism. There's, within this table, you could put in a date or time. Excuse me, not a date. You could put in a time of how long that code was valid. So over here, you could check both, did they enter the code and is the code within a certain period? You can get pretty elaborate in this if you want to. This is just a pretty basic generated code. And that code is a formula that based upon some incrementing value and some other formula, it builds that code, which will always generate unique codes. It's not just like a random. It's based on kind of a incrementing piece and then adds things and does a specific piece to it.
Okay, so on the error message, how do you keep them from continuing to the system on the error message screen?
Good question. Let's see what we do. Verification. I'm not sure, to be honest.
I remember reading somewhere in the flows there's like an output variable you can set that if you set it to true, it basically logs the user out right away. And so I was wondering if you were setting that in there.
And that's why, yeah, I was looking here to see if I could see that was getting done, which I'm not at this point. All I see is a message.
Okay.
I would guess you could send them back to the first part of the flow and just keep them in the loop, maybe.
At that point, though, you'd probably have to generate a new code.
Yeah.
Because if they actually used one that had already been done or didn't exist, you'd have to have some mechanism say, okay, generate a new code, send them out, which, yeah, that we could do that. I'm trying, I don't see anything here that says.
Natalya, hey, this is John.
Hey.
You're right. There is that code if you return false, it will log them out and fail the login attempt completely. Yeah.
So let's look in the decision and actually see if that's part of what's getting set. Nope.
And it could be if you're not explicitly setting true, it could be forcing you to log out at that point as well.
That's true. Yeah, take a look at the Explorer.
I'll find out what we're doing here. I'll ask the person who developed it and see how we're blocking him.
Well, go over to your Explorer. Let's see if we can figure it out. So where's our specially named? Yeah, we don't even have any special variables. Interesting.
Well, so let's see something here. Let's
try it.
Yep. Let's try it. Oh, it does have a finish. What does finish do? Haha.
Oops. This is an incomplete flow.
So that's why we don't see that it's there, because it's not.
Okay. So do you still have the documentation page up that has the those special variables? Because right past that it says the login flow
right there, gotcha.
log out. So if we add an element and set that to true, it should log you out.
So Jeff, once you have your flow created, do you then use the flow login piece on the setup menu?
Yes.
Is that?
Yeah. Let me get to that piece, because I haven't really shown that. I don't think I can see it as this user. So let me show you how you actually set that all up. And while we're doing some other things, I'll go in and try and set that and see if I can force that thing to jump out.
Yep.
Go into here.
For those that joined late, while Jeff is logging in, after we're done talking about SAML, we're going to stop recording, but I would ask all of you to stay on for a little bit. Just want to talk about planning and figuring out how we fit in all the rest of the content we need to fit in before our study group sessions are done before Christmas. So hang around. Don't jump off just because we're done with SAML, because I want to get a little bit of input from you, and we'll finish by 9 o'clock.
So this is one of the downsides if you have a lot of profiles, because this is a flow per profile. And so you can utilize the same flow, but you have to attach it to every profile that you want to then utilize that. So there's not a mechanism to say, I want these 5 profiles to all use the same. It's kind of like a 1 by 1. So let's pop into one of these. You're basically just naming it. You assign the actual flow that you want to run, and then you assign the profile. I don't know about this flow in Lightning runtime. I have to see if anybody knows what checking that or does it if you're within Lightning. We don't run Lightning, so I didn't actually look at that, but I know that adds an extra feature you can do here. But it really is just defining the flow, picking the flow and picking the profile that it is assigned to.
Yeah, can you click new, Jeff? Let's create a new one, because it also asks you about a user license.
Oh yeah, you're right. So the license kind of gives you what profiles are available, I think is why it's asking that. So yeah, you have to define whether you want a Visualforce page or an actual flow. That'll guide you through 2 different ways. And then it just lists your flows. And you go and pick the one, which we have a lot in this org. And then your user license is what's going to then define what profiles you can attach it to, because they're all assigned to a specific license. So once you pick it, then you only have the available profiles that are associated with that license. And if we were to switch that, and I picked chatter external, which you can do it against the chatters, you now see that your profile list is much smaller. So it is all based upon that license. Now for that pick list, login flows user interface resembles Lightning experience. Otherwise, the user interface resembles Salesforce. Okay. So it's just whether you want that page to look like Lightning or Classic.
Yeah, and also if you, I don't know if you could do it in a login flow, I assume you can. If you wanted to embed a Lightning component in your flow, then it has to be set to render in Lightning runtime.
Oh, that's good to know.
Okay, yeah, that is good now. Anything else we want to look at while we're here?
All right, sounds like that's it. Thank you, Jeff.
You bet.
I'm going to pop my slides back up just because, not for any other good reason. And again, once we're done with our discussions, please stick around so we can talk about how we maximize our time for the remaining sessions. So now we open it up to SAML in your own words. And I am actually just going to go down the list and start picking on people to talk. So be prepared. And what we're going to start with is just, if you had to explain SAML to somebody else, the basic idea of SAML, the basic flow of SAML, how would you explain it to them? And I'm going to start with Satish.
Wow, you had to pick on me first. Yeah. So I would say SAML is a standard. It stands for security assertion markup language. It helps when you want to use several applications that can authenticate the user with the same credentials. The help with that is that since it's a standard, and these several applications, they're not built on the same platform. One could be in Salesforce, the other could be on Java. They all follow this standard, but they're able to have this handshake because there is a standard to say, hey, we follow this standard. We talk to each other based on identity provider, and we can then have the user login. That's in simple terms, that's what it is. The other thing that's important for me is SAML. And again, you guys can correct me if it's wrong. It's a browser-based protocol. So the browser is doing a lot of dance in the flow, especially between the ID provider and the service provider. So that's something that's important for me to also know. That's what I would say, SAML is.
Very cool. Amit, what do you want to add to that? Or have, as I'm calling on the rest of you, also think about if you can make an analogy that outside of computers on how SAML will work. Like if you read the Beer Drinker's Guide to SAML, the guy was using an example of getting a wristband so he could go buy a beer at the beer tent. So if you have an analogy like that, please share that. Or if you want to add anything or say in a different way what people before you have already said, then jump in. And Amit, you're up. Amit, you're muted, so please unmute.
Hey, sorry.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks. Satish explained most of the things correctly. One analogy which I was reading through regarding the beer drinkers guide, which was provided, was really good, was that if it's something similar to how we go to even a club, wherein if you want to take an entry into the club, you have to show your ID card just to say that you're above 21, and then they let you in. So that is basically, and they give you a wristband and let you in. So that is basically you're saying that they're authenticating you. And then once you're authenticated and you're inside that, you don't need to show your ID every time. Your wristband that you have is good. So that is like, if you want to go and take a drink, you can with your wristband, the server will be able to give you a drink, and you don't need to take your ID again and again. So that is where I was able to take that analogy of doing an authentication by identity provider, and then using the wristband as a SAML for getting access to all the other apps that we need once you're already authenticated.
Very cool. All right. Pavitra, what do you want to add to this?
I just want to explain something more about the SAML in itself. So when we say SAML protocol, basically when we need to understand some part of the SAML protocol. So so from a SAML perspective, what it has, basically we know that the SAML identity management, we are going to use it for authentication, authorization, and also get some of the user attributes. So from a SAML assertion perspective, we are going to have it has the whole thing has 4 parts to it. The first part is what we call as SAML, what we call as assertions. So these assertion attributes are mostly contain mostly the authentication attributes of it, like who the user is, or where he was logged in and what time he logged in, etc. So some of those authentication attributes will be there in the assertion. And then there is other thing in the assertion, like user attributes, and then the authorization attributes. When we say user attributes, there can be additional information about the users in that assertion. And then there is authorization attribute, where it kind of gives in the assertion, it says like when this authorization should be when you have to give permission for certain functionalities or certain apps. So that kind of details will, and what is the condition when this user can access certain apps is what the authorization attributes would contain. So that kind of will have all the assertions. And then the SAML also contains something called as protocol, and these protocols are like the exchange between the request and response exchange between the IDP and the service providers, so how they exchange. And there is something called as binding. Binding is the transportation layer, like how these request response between these two would happen. So like we talked about the mostly the user agent or the browser, which does everything, right? So basically what we are talking about is like, this is actually a web browser based SSO profile, wherein the user agent or the browser through HTTP protocol, the whole exchange happens. And then there is something called as profile, where I talked about like web browser profile. So that profile is actually, it contains these assertions, binding, and protocol all together is what the profile of the SAML. So the most standard which we usually use is web browser based profile of SAML, and that's how it works. So basically when we get this SAML XML, it contains all these details, like the assertions what we have, and based on that assertion, the service provider can make a call whether this user can access this app, whether he was identified, and whether his identity is correct and what kind of apps that user can access, and also some of the user attributes can flow from identity provider.
Wow, a lot of information. Okay, very cool. Jassim, what do you want to add to that? Or if you have an analogy for us.
Oh, yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I think we have covered most of the points about Salesforce, but I want to say in short, when it comes to authentication, whether it is SAML or any other methods, what we basically look at is who you are and what you can do. So that's the two main concepts in SAML authentication. So basically, I think that's what Pavitra was touching. So in SAML assertions, you need to have the certificate, which basically tells you who you are, or basically you are coming from an authenticated source. So in the handshake, when the certificate is verified, that who you are is kind of verified. And then it comes to what you can do, which basically in the SAML assertion, you have the user details, the username, and that comes with a profile. So that basically gives you what you can do. So that's what I just wanted to touch on.
Great, thank you. Good.
Natalya, can I ask a quick question? Maybe quick. Can you define the difference between SAML, OAuth, and the Web Service Federation? I'm a little bit puzzled as to how those differ.
You want me to answer that? Yeah, let's throw the group. My understanding was SAML is really about who the person is, so the authentication. The OAuth gives, so SAML says this person is who they say they are because I say they are. And then I think of OAuth as the system actually asks that person, hey, can I do things on your behalf? It's like a power of attorney almost. And we'll get into OAuth on Friday as well, and maybe that'll help clear it up. But OAuth is more about a user granting a system privileges to do things on their behalf, whereas SAML just tells one system, hey, I trust this user, I trust he is who he says he is, but doesn't really say anything about what they can do. Although Pavitra said that we could pass some information, so maybe I'm wrong there.
Right, through auto provisioning, you actually can pass quite a bit of information to do your authorization. And we're actually doing that in one org where, based on setting a profile from Active Directory, it sets the profile when it creates the user of what they can get to. So you can pass, who the person is, their name, and so forth, and you can hook it up to actual groups or whatnot that can drive your authorization as well.
Yeah. That was awesome. If I may add, right, the way I see it is, SAML started as a standard because of the need for these federated applications that we have in the enterprise, and the problem of just users having to log into every single application. That's how SAML started as a standard. OAuth, on the other hand, started as a standard because we have these applications that talk to each other. And remember in the old days where we have a service account and a password that's configured in a INI file somewhere. That's how to alleviate that problem. OAuth was brought in as a standard. That's how I don't know if that helps.
That's helpful. So it sounds like what you're saying is SAML basically sends a user from one system to another, but then the user, SAML basically sends information from the IDP, sends it to the SP, but then the user is just talking to the service provider at that point, and the IDP is out of the picture. Whereas OAuth says, it's like the user uses OAuth to give two separate systems permission to talk to each other.
Right. OAuth gives a standard for resources. It doesn't deal with authentication.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sir Terry? Or did it help, or did it just confuse the issue?
No, that helped. What confused me was the beer drinker's guide when it got into the three differences, and so the clarification was really helpful.
Okay. Yeah, and Federation ID, that's kind of the thing you pass around so that you can have the same identity in multiple places. So let's see. Brenda, did you want to add anything to this?
Sure. So I think a good analogy is when you're traveling at the airport, right? Because there's really three parties in SAML, right? So there's the user, the person who wants to get access. There's the service provider, which is the thing they want to get access to. And then there's the identity provider, which validates that they are who they say they are and that it's okay for them to have access. So I thought of the analogy of me, if I am traveling to California from Atlanta, I am the passenger, right? So I'm the user. The TSA is the identity provider. So they are making sure I am who I say I am, checking my ID, making sure that I don't have bad things with me. And then the service provider is the airplane or the airport itself, like beyond the TSA gates. So that was kind of the analogy that I thought of.
That's a good analogy. So yeah, the gate agent taking your ticket to let you on the plane doesn't care how you got into the concourse. They just know that you got there and somebody authorized you and said you're good to be here.
Exactly.
And the TSA person doesn't care whether you get on a plane or not. Their job is just to let you through.
Yep.
So it's interesting that you talk about. I actually had a similar analogy dealing with. There's this. If you guys have traveled on planes, there's a service called TSA PreCheck, where if you have it stamped on your boarding pass, then you don't have to take out your laptop. You don't have to take out your liquids. You can keep your shoes on when you go through the point. Really convenient. And the way you get TSA PreCheck is your boarding pass just has a little logo. It says TSA PreCheck on it. And when up to the TSA person, all they care about is that you have that little check mark on your boarding pass. They don't know how you got that check mark. My husband's active duty military, he gets that check mark because he's got a CAC card and he just puts in from his CAC card as his trusted traveler ID. Me, I signed up for a program called Global Entry, which also gives me that known traveler number, and I can put that on my plane reservation, and I get the magic PreCheck symbol. But the TSA guy doesn't care how I got it. They just want that I have that check mark, and because I have that check mark, I'm allowed to keep my shoes on, I'm allowed to keep my liquids in my bag, and just put my bag on the conveyor belt without having to take everything out.
Right, and that's pretty much what SAML's doing. It doesn't care who you are or how the identity provider is identifying you. All it does is take that the identity provider says, here's who you are. Also doesn't care what service you're going to connect to or what you can do in that other thing. All it does is say, I'm taking the information that the identity provider says, here's who you are. I'm passing it to the service so the service knows who you are. I'm done. It's just kind of that conduit in between. Doesn't care on either side what's going on.
Cool. All right. Brenda, did we pick on you yet?
Yep, that was me with the TSA.
All right. Losing track here.
Okay.
Okay. Any final thoughts from anybody on SAML? Otherwise, again, please stick around for a few minutes after we're done.
I just wanted to add that one thing that's never really mentioned is SAML requires a web browser.
Oh, yeah. Yep. That has been brought up, and we'll need to remember that because I could just see that coming up on an exam somewhere about some mainframe trying to access a system and no, you can't use SAML with it.
So there are another topic that I wanted to mention. I'm not expert in this, but I know there are two different flows for SAML. One is the identity provided initiated, and the other one is service provided initiated. Basically, what it is for the identity provided initiated is when you go to a place like an app launcher. In Salesforce, we have Aloha, but someplace where you go there, then you authenticate, and then you go to the applications you want to go. So maybe you go to a place where you log in, and then you can go to your intranet or your email or any applications. That's when it's initiated in the identity provider. The other flow that is the service provided identity initiated is when, for example, you send an email to your customer saying your case has been updated, or your case has been approved, something like that, and you send the link in the email to that record. So that what happened is that's service provider initiated. What happened is the user will use that link to attempt to get directly to the resource, to that particular record. And then what happened is that service provider first need to authenticate and redirect to the browser to get the authentication and then come back to get you access to the resource. So you have two different flows.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and that is on the study guide of knowing when do you use the IDP initiated flow. And Paulina has just explained that very nicely, that when you're using the app launcher to send people off to other sites, that's an IDP initiated flow. And the other example being you start at the service provider, but they send you back to the identity provider to get authenticated. And then you come back to the service provider to actually access your resources.
And by the way, that's where the browser base becomes important, because if you actually outline that, really the service provider is not going to the identity provider, it's going back to the browser, that then goes to the identity provider, that then goes back to the browser, and then goes back to the service provider. So you're like adding 3 additional steps.
Yep.
And you're going SP versus IDP. I've got a picture of that. I'll load it somewhere. I can't find it right now, but a lot of people are in our company were asking what's the difference. So I outlined that in a picture, but I can't find it right now.
Yeah, I found a good picture somewhere too, and I had to dig for it for a while when I was taking screen grabs of all the different flows. But yeah, so Jeff makes a very good point that it's actually the browser doing the redirects. So the service provider sends a redirect request to the browser redirects to the identity provider. Identity provider issues the assertion, sends another redirect request, which redirects back to the service provider, and finally the user gets to access their resources.
If I may add, Jeff, is that also an advantage if you want to, let's say, restrict the users to internal network, and if you use an IDP flow, you could sort of have that URL not exposed externally, and you can start, and that sort of becomes your protected endpoint.
Yeah, I don't know if that's your best way to say it's just on your network. Depending on which IDP you're using, some of them may only run on your network. Ours is set up that what it forwards to for the IDP is an internal connection that if you're not on our VPN, it can't resolve. So even through the service provider, you have to be on our network, because it will then forward to an internal link. If you're not on not on the VPN, it basically fails. So
just a thought to I just brought this up because I thought I read somewhere in the, I don't know if it will come up as an exam question, as to what are the advantages of having one versus the other. And one of the things that I was thinking through is that an advantage? Just want to bring that up.
Typically your IDP initiated are much longer, because you have to give the URL of your identity provider, then you have to include a parameter to forward back to Salesforce, even with your deep link. So those become very ugly. So typically where we use those is on our internal website, where we can, put it up as an href with just saying Salesforce login. Behind the scenes, we have the big gnarly URL that does everything for you, that passes you on. If you're sending emails out, you don't want to send some big gnarly thing like that. You're basically just going to send your domain name with the record you want to get to. So that's where it'd be the service provider, because that's nice and clean sending out versus this big thing that's usually the IDP. So we do it more, in terms of convenience of, if we're on our internal network, we just go directly to the IDP when we're sending out emails. You have a nice clean domain name with the ID on it, and then that does the service provider when you log in.
Got it. Thank you.
One more thing we did not mention about is the certificate. So the service provider will have a certificate so that it can identify that the SAML assertions which received is actually from a valid IDP. So there is that step where the validation of the SAML assertion happens through digital certificate.
Good point. And the service provider can also choose to send a certificate to the identity provider. And if that's depending on how that's configured, if they don't send a certificate, the request could fail even if the user password is correct. So keep that in mind as well. Lots of details to keep track of. Any final thoughts on SAML? All right, so again, please stick around. I wanted to kind of get your information on some things. Again, a reminder of our schedule and resource links that are out there. Please don't drop off yet. And for next session, we're going to talk about OpenID, or for the next session, your pre-work is to learn about OpenID, the SSO overview, do the setup SSO trailhead, and after the trailhead, use what you've done there, and you're going to break your SSO. And because there are several things in the study guide that talk about debugging SSO issues, and so here you'll have a chance to kind of play around with that where you know how you broke it, so you can see what the SAML validator tells you in that case. And then for Friday, we have a couple of Quizmasters, and then the same discussion we did today on SAML, we're going to do with OAuth. Again, just high-level concepts. We're not going to get to the nitty-gritty of the flows yet. We will get there, I promise you. With that, please stick around. I am going to stop the recording now, and then we're just going to do an off discussion with the group for a few minutes. So recording is now stopped.